In the basement storage rooms of the Greco-Roman Museum in Alexandria, Egypt, there is a catalog entry that most visitors never see. It reads, Artifact Reference GRM 96AT04. Dark gray granite. Feline body. Human face. Estimated weight 400 kilograms. Recovery depth 5 meters below sea level. Recovery date 1996. And then, in the notes column, 3 words that should stop you cold. Royal Quarter Provenance. Most people walk right past it. The museum has thousands of such entries. Fragments pulled from the seabed, cataloged, numbered, and shelved. But this particular piece, this particular sphinx, is not a relic pulled from a desert dig or a collapsed wall. It was found on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, lying in the mud of the eastern harbor of Alexandria, lying exactly where someone placed it 2,000 years ago, in front of the entrance to a temple. And that temple, along with the palace behind it, the royal gardens beside it, the harbor walls surrounding it, is still down there. Not ruins scattered across a hillside, not fragments in a museum case. An entire royal quarter sitting on the seafloor, largely intact, 5 to 8 meters beneath the surface of the water, where ordinary fishing boats pass over it every single day. The palace of Cleopatra is not lost. It did not burn. It did not crumble into dust. It sank. And divers have been inside it. Here's where it gets strange. Because the palace didn't disappear into myth and legend the way most ancient structures do. It was documented. It was described in precise detail by ancient writers who walked its corridors and stood in its gardens. And when modern underwater archaeologists began matching those ancient descriptions to what they found on the seafloor, the correspondence was not approximate. It was exact. This is not a story about searching for something. This is a story about something that was always there, waiting in the dark water, perfectly preserved, completely ignored, and what happened when a small team of researchers finally decided to look. If you want to understand how much of our ancient world we have simply failed to look at, you need to stay with me for this one. And if this kind of forensic investigation keeps you up at night, make sure you're subscribed before we go any further, because this channel goes where most documentary filmmakers are afraid to follow. Let's begin with what we know. In antiquity, Alexandria was not just a city. It was arguably the most sophisticated urban environment in the ancient world. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC on the Egyptian coast, it was designed from scratch, a planned city laid out on a grid, with enormous boulevards, a harbor complex so advanced that it stunned Roman engineers who visited it centuries later, and a royal quarter so exclusive that only royalty, dignitaries, and their immediate households were permitted to enter. The royal quarter had a name, the Bruchion. Ancient geographers, most prominently the Greek writer Strabo, who visited Alexandria around 24 BC, described it in extraordinary detail. Strabo wrote that the royal palaces occupied nearly a third of the entire city. He described the royal harbor as a protected inner port, shielded by a cape on one side and an island on the other. That island had a name, Antirhodos. Strabo wrote that Antirhodos was a small island facing the harbors, having a palace and a small port of its own. He noted that the royals would sail to it directly, away from the main harbor traffic, and that it functioned as a private enclave within the larger royal quarter. He described its position relative to the Great Lighthouse, the causeway, the main breakwater, and the Temple of Poseidon. His description is not poetry. It reads like a pilot's chart. And for nearly 2,000 years, those descriptions were treated as exactly that. Ancient prose, beautiful, evocative, historically interesting, but unverifiable, because Antirhodos Island, along with most of the royal quarter, had been swallowed by the sea. For decades, scholars dismissed the ancient account of the royal harbor as approximate at best. They assumed the city's layout had been so thoroughly destroyed by earthquakes, floods, conquest, and time that any attempt to reconstruct it physically was impossible. The coastline had changed. The harbor had shifted. Whatever was down there was broken, scattered, and buried under centuries of sediment. Then, modern science found something that changed everything. In 1992, a French underwater archaeologist named Franck Goddio formed the Institut Européen d'Archéologie Sous-Marine, the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology. Working in cooperation with the Egyptian government and funded in part by the Hilti Foundation, Goddio's team began something that had never been attempted at Alexandria: a systematic, scientific, comprehensive survey of the Eastern Harbor's seafloor. They didn't dive blind. They used nuclear magnetic resonance equipment, side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profilers, and cesium magnetometers, the same tools used by offshore oil companies to map geological formations beneath the ocean floor. Goddio's team applied them to an area of roughly 400 hectares of harbor bottom, generating maps of extraordinary precision. What they found changed the discipline of archaeology. Within the first seasons of work, Goddio's divers began surfacing with artifacts, not fragments, not shards, intact statues, columns in perfect condition, stone anchors still sitting on the seafloor where ancient sailors dropped them. The sediment in the eastern harbor, it turned out, is not rock or coral. It is soft, fine silt, and that silt had acted like a sealed vault. It had buried the ruins the moment they sank, sealing them against currents, against scavengers, against the biological degradation that destroys most submerged organic material over time. In 1996, after 4 years of mapping, Goddio's team located the island of Antirhodos, not a theory about where it might have been, not a guess based on Strabo's prose. The island itself, its stone foundations, its harbor walls, its internal structures, all still sitting on the seafloor at a depth of between 4 and 8 meters below the surface of the water. Strabo's description, translated from ancient Greek into spatial coordinates, placed the island almost exactly where the sonar maps showed the submerged structures to be. They had found the private island of the last pharaohs of Egypt, the island where Julius Caesar and Mark Antony came to visit Cleopatra, the island from which she may have sailed on her final journey. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter. Now let's go through the clues. 3 separate pieces of ancient testimony, 3 corresponding discoveries on the seafloor, clues that match in ways that still don't have a comfortable explanation. The first clue comes from Strabo himself. He described a cape extending into the eastern harbor, crowned by a temple dedicated to the god Poseidon. He called this formation the Poseidium and noted that it contained a building he described as resembling a theater, projecting into the sea. His language here is precise, not a general description of a curved structure. A theater, something with tiered, curved stonework, designed to project outward over the water. For 2,000 years, the Poseidium was assumed to be either destroyed or completely inaccessible. Scholars placed it somewhere along the modern Alexandria waterfront, buried beneath the modern city's foundations. When Goddio's team mapped the seafloor adjacent to what they identified as Antirhodos, they found something unexpected. A curved formation of stone blocks, arranged in a semicircular pattern, sitting directly on the harbor bottom. The curve of the structure is consistent with a Roman period theater or auditorium. The stone is limestone, dressed and fitted, not a natural formation. And it sits at a depth of approximately 6 meters in exactly the position Strabo described. Not similar to Strabo's description. Not inspired by it. The same. The mainstream interpretation of this structure is that it represents the foundation remains of a harborside ceremonial building. But that explanation has a problem. The curvature of the stone arrangement and its orientation toward the open water matches the specific architectural features Strabo described in a way that a simple ceremonial building doesn't quite account for. Either Strabo was describing what he was actually seeing with extraordinary precision, or both Strabo and the seafloor happen to agree on a detail that appears nowhere else in the ancient record. The second clue comes from a different ancient source entirely. The Roman historian Appian, writing in the 2nd century AD, described Alexandria's royal harbor as containing a structure he called the Timonium, a private residence built by Mark Antony during the final months of his life, when he and Cleopatra were surrounded by Octavian's forces. Appian described the Timonium as a building constructed on a mole, a stone breakwater platform, extending into the harbor, isolated from the main city and accessible only by boat. He described Antony retreating there alone after his military defeat, renouncing human society, comparing himself to Timon of Athens, the ancient symbol of bitter isolation. For scholars, the Timonium was always treated as literary drama, a poetic detail, a metaphor for Antony's psychological collapse. Nobody seriously argued it was a real physical structure that could be located. Then Goddio's divers found it. On the seafloor of the eastern harbor, directly adjacent to the Antirhodos structures, they identified the remains of a stone mole, a man-made breakwater platform extending into the harbor with the foundations of a rectangular structure built upon it. The dimensions of the mole match Appian's description of an extended platform. The rectangular foundation is consistent with a private residential structure of the late Ptolemaic period. And most significantly, it is isolated. There is no connected land structure. It genuinely could only have been reached by boat. They weren't guessing. They were recording. The Timonium, the last refuge of Mark Antony, the place where one of history's most consequential men spent his final days before his death, is sitting on the floor of Alexandria Harbor, 4 to 6 meters of water overhead, fishing boats passing above, and almost nobody knows it exists. The third clue is the most significant and the most contested. Ancient sources, including the historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st century AD, describe Cleopatra constructing a monument near the royal harbor during the final period of her reign. Plutarch used language that translates most directly as a funerary monument and placed it within the royal enclosure, near the harbor itself. He wrote that Cleopatra prepared this structure in advance, intending it as her tomb, and that she stockpiled treasure there in the months before Octavian's arrival. He wrote that she ultimately retreated there, and that Octavian's soldiers had to break through the door to reach her. Cleopatra's tomb has never been found. This is one of the great unsolved mysteries of classical archaeology. Scholars have spent decades searching the land around Alexandria, in the desert, beneath the modern city, at a site called Taposiris Magna, 60 kilometers to the west. None of those searches have produced a confirmed identification. But here is what the underwater evidence suggests. Goddio's team, in the course of mapping the royal quarter on the seafloor, identified a complex of structures on and around Antirhodos Island that includes what appears to be the foundation outline of a substantial enclosed building, larger than a residential structure, internally subdivided in a way consistent with a ceremonial or funerary complex, oriented toward the harbor in a way that matches Plutarch's description of a building accessible from the royal enclosure by boat. Not a myth, not a metaphor. This structure exists. It has been mapped, it has been photographed, it has not been excavated. And the reason it has not been excavated is where this investigation takes a turn. In the years following the initial discoveries, Goddio's team sought an expanded excavation license that would have allowed systematic archaeological investigation of the submerged royal quarter, including the structures on Antirhodos that potentially correspond to the location described by Plutarch. The process required full approval from Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities. Those approvals, for the most sensitive structures, were not fully granted. The official reasoning involved legitimate concerns: international archaeological access to Egyptian cultural heritage, sovereignty over submerged sites, and the logistical complexity of excavating an active commercial harbor. These are real issues, serious ones. But what they also mean practically is that the largest submerged Ptolemaic structure ever identified, the one that most closely matches ancient descriptions of Cleopatra's final monument, has not been opened. The sediment above it has not been removed. Whatever is beneath that sediment has not been seen. It was sealed, it was mapped, and then it stalled. The report from Goddio's most comprehensive mapping seasons, covering work between 1996 and 2004, was published in full. The data is accessible to researchers, but the physical structures themselves remain on the seafloor, partially buried, in a harbor used daily by commercial shipping, where anchor drag and propeller wash are steadily disturbing stone that survived 2,000 years of submersion intact. The clock is not stopping. Now, does this prove the most extreme version of the story? Probably not. The claim that Cleopatra's tomb is sitting intact on the floor of Alexandria harbor is unconfirmed. It may remain unconfirmed without excavation that the current environment has not yet permitted. That uncertainty is real, and it matters. But that doesn't make the discovery ordinary, not even close. What Goddio's surveys confirmed, even setting aside the question of the tomb entirely, is that an entire functioning royal city lies preserved beneath 5 to 8 meters of water in one of Egypt's busiest harbors. The sphinxes, the columns, the floors, the harbor walls, the timonium, the structures Strabo described, all there. More than 20,000 objects cataloged from this one area of seafloor, including 30 sphinxes, 5 obelisks, a granite sphinx identified with near certainty as a portrait of Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's own father, and a pleasure boat hull more than 35 meters long and 7 meters wide, found near Antirhodos, still largely intact. The skeptical position that all of this is coincidental, that ancient sources are being overinterpreted, that the structural remains don't tell us what they appear to tell us, requires you to believe something very specific. It requires you to believe that Strabo's description of the royal harbor happened to match the seafloor by extraordinary luck, that Appian's description of the timonium happened to coincide with a random breakwater formation, that Plutarch's description of Cleopatra's monument happened to align with a large enclosed structure on a sunken island, all by accident, all independently. Coincidence is possible, but it becomes increasingly difficult to invoke when 3 ancient sources, writing across 3 different centuries in 3 different languages, and 3 independent physical formations on the seafloor, all describe the same arrangement of the same place with the same orientation and the same relationships to the same landmarks. Here is what this discovery means at full scale. If the royal quarter of Alexandria is as intact as Goddio's surveys suggest, and the evidence is substantial that it is, then what lies beneath the harbor water is not merely an archaeological site. It is the physical environment in which the most consequential political events of the late ancient world took place. The rooms where Caesar and Cleopatra negotiated the stabilization of the Mediterranean world. The harbor from which Antony and Cleopatra launched their campaign against Octavian. The enclosure where the last Ptolemaic pharaoh prepared for her death with a deliberateness that ancient sources describe in remarkable detail. This matters beyond the archaeology, because Cleopatra VII was not simply the last queen of Egypt. She was the culmination of 300 years of Macedonian Greek rule over the most culturally complex civilization in the ancient world. Her dynasty had preserved, synthesized, and transmitted enormous volumes of Egyptian, Greek, Babylonian, and Persian knowledge. The kind of knowledge compiled in the Library of Alexandria and never fully recovered after the city's decline. Knowing where she died, where she was buried, what objects surrounded her in those final hours, that knowledge has direct implications for understanding what was preserved and what was permanently lost in one of history's great cultural ruptures. And there is one question the evidence raises that nobody has answered cleanly. In Plutarch's account of Cleopatra's death, he writes that she was found in her tomb, dressed in her royal robes, already dead. He describes the scene in physical detail that suggests his source had access to first-person testimony. But he makes no reference to her being removed from the tomb and reburied elsewhere. Neither does any other ancient source. Octavian, who controlled Alexandria after her death, and who had every political reason to desecrate her memory and her burial, made no record of relocating or destroying her tomb, which means she was buried somewhere, and that somewhere has never been found on land. In the harbor of Alexandria, 5 to 8 meters beneath the surface, there is a structure on the floor of a sunken island that has not been opened. It has been mapped by sonar. It has been photographed by divers. Its foundations have been measured. Its orientation has been recorded. And it has not been excavated. The earthquake that sent most of it to the bottom occurred on July 21, 365 AD. A magnitude 8.0 event centered near the Hellenic Arc off the coast of Crete, which generated a tsunami documented across the eastern Mediterranean by multiple ancient writers. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus described the sea withdrawing completely from the Alexandria shoreline before returning in a wall of water. The ground beneath the royal quarter, composed of soft alluvial sediment sitting above clay-rich subterranean layers, liquefied. The coastline didn't collapse. It slid, intact, into the sea, and the sediment closed over it. The Sphinx that sits in the Greco-Roman Museum, catalog number GRM 96 AT04, dark gray granite, 400 kilograms, recovered from 5 meters depth, was one of two that flanked the entrance to a small temple on the island of Antirhodos. The second Sphinx is still down there, still lying on the seafloor where it fell 17 centuries ago, still positioned in front of a temple door that has not been opened in all the time since the harbor water rushed in around it. Commercial ships pass over it a dozen times a day. Fishing nets drag across the harbor bottom. The water is murky, industrial, unremarkable to anyone standing on the dock who doesn't know what lies beneath the surface. But the island is down there. The structures are down there. The sediment is still sealing whatever is beneath it. And the question that Strabo, Appian, and Plutarch each pointed toward in their different centuries, from their different vantage points, with their different levels of access, is still sitting unanswered at the bottom of the sea. Not solved, not lost, not destroyed. Just waiting. And no one has looked inside. If this kind of forensic investigation into what history forgot is what you come here for, hit the like button and subscribe. We follow the evidence without stopping. And the next video goes even deeper. Click right there. The story isn't finished yet.